June 2025, Santa Monica, California. The light was clinically harsh that morning, slicing through the panoramic windows of the penthouse apartment overlooking the Pacific. The scene was instantly registered by Detective Sergeant Elena Chen as a carefully curated tableau. Silk sheets in disarray, a single shattered wineglass, and 19-year-old Zahra Hassan, a student at UCLA, found lifeless on the white marble floor of the master bathroom. The initial report, generated by the emergency services called by the building's concierge, cited a probable overdose or an accidental fall. It was too clean, too tragically perfect for an accident. Zahra, the daughter of a prominent Damascus surgeon, had arrived in Los Angeles only 2 years prior, a beacon of ambition and hope, her path meticulously charted from a war-torn country to an elite American university. Her social media profile, frozen in time, showed a life of effortless glamour. Poolside selfies, designer shopping bags, and cryptic captions about living without limits. The dramatic irony was immediately palpable to Chen. The image Zahra projected was a dazzling, deceptive veil, a facade that cost more than a single student could ever afford. The first clue was not physical, but financial. Zahra's tuition, notoriously steep, was always paid on time, from a private, non-parental trust account managed by an offshore financial services company registered in the Cayman Islands. A 19-year-old on a scholarship does not manage a Cayman Islands trust. The physical setup confirmed Chen's professional skepticism. The apartment, leased under the name of a shell corporation called Pacific Vision Holdings, was opulent but sterile, clearly a temporary residence or a high-end rental, lacking the personal warmth of a home. There were 2 wardrobes, one filled with Zahra's youthful, casual clothes, and another triple the size, housing an entirely new, high-fashion identity. Expensive leather, high heels and couture that screamed trophy, not student. The most immediate chilling discovery was Zahra's phone, found resting neatly on a bedside table, completely wiped clean. No photos, no messages, no call logs. A digital scorched earth policy executed hours after her death. It was the first, undeniable proof of a systematic cleanup, a professional attempt to eliminate the narrative of her final tormented months. Chen knew this was not an accident. It was a termination, an extraction of a problem that had become too volatile. The investigation had to begin not with finding a killer, but with reconstructing the ghost of a relationship, a secret affair that existed only in the fleeting, encrypted shadows of the internet. The systematic manipulation was already apparent in the environment. The apartment was a gilded cage designed for dependency and isolation. The security system was sophisticated, with cameras covering every entrance and exit, but none inside the apartment itself, a common tactic of control that provided security for the owner while ensuring total, undocumented privacy for the activities within. The silence of the apartment, once the police tape was up, was deafening, the vast, echoing space a monument to the lie that had consumed Zahra's life. Chen initiated a global asset trace on Pacific Vision Holdings, recognizing the offshore structure as the signature of a professional seeking not just wealth, but total, unassailable anonymity. The initial search was an exercise in frustration, the digital trail vanishing into a labyrinth of international holding companies, all pointing back to a single, untraceable private equity fund. It was the moment the scale of the operation became terrifyingly clear. Zahra Hassan was not simply the victim of a bad date. She was a casualty of a calculated, organized system of exploitation that transcended simple romance or greed, leveraging her profound isolation and ambition against her. The investigation had moved from a tragic local incident to a high-stakes international financial and psychological crime, a discovery that would soon expose the network that preys on the dreams of the world's most vulnerable yet aspirational young people. The narrative now required a deep dive into the emotional landscape of the victim, a critical step in the style profile's mandate to establish the hopeful origin that made the subsequent vulnerability so profound, bridging the gap between the tragic aftermath and the calculated beginning. The story of Zahra Hassan, the brilliant girl from Damascus, was one of immense, intergenerational hope, a classic immigrant narrative twisted into a nightmare by modern exploitation. Her family, rooted in the fierce intellectual tradition of Syrian academia, had sacrificed everything to send her to America. She had won a partial scholarship to the prestigious computer science program at UCLA, carrying the weight of not only her own future, but the entire family's financial and emotional well-being. Zara arrived in Los Angeles in August 2023, bright-eyed and determined, but quickly encountered the brutal reality of a hyper-expensive city and a culturally isolating academic environment. Her partial scholarship covered tuition, but not the exorbitant cost of living, leading to a constant, gnawing anxiety about money, a vulnerability that predators are exquisitely trained to spot and exploit. Her social media, initially a place of genuine connection, began its slow, tragic evolution. It was there, on a professional networking site, that she was first contacted by the predator, Marcus Thorne. Thorne, 58, was the architect of Thorne Philanthropic Initiatives, a glossy foundation ostensibly dedicated to mentoring international students in STEM fields. He was the classic professional predator, well-connected, articulate, and possessing a terrifyingly effective ability to project an image of paternal, benevolent power. The initial contact was subtle, intellectual, and completely non-sexual, a brilliant implementation of the flattery stage. Thorne offered not money, but access, an invitation to a private networking seminar, an introduction to a tech CEO, and a consistent, lavish praise of Zara's academic potential. He called her a future leader, a diamond in the rough, terms that appealed directly to her deepest, most potent vulnerability, her immigrant ambition, and her need for validation in a country where she felt invisible. The financial assistance began almost accidentally, disguised as an internship stipend or a research grant, funds that immediately resolved her crushing financial anxiety, forging a profound, unconscious link in Zara's mind between Thorne and salvation. The stipends grew quickly, moving beyond necessity to luxury, a deliberate tactic of manufactured dependency. He didn't just pay her rent. He moved her into a furnished, safe apartment far above her means, isolating her from her struggling, genuine student peers who would have provided a natural system of checks and balances. The isolation and dependency stage was ruthlessly efficient. Thorne required absolute secrecy, framing it as a necessity to protect her scholarship from potential jealousy or institutional interference, a brilliant piece of psychological judo that turned her community into a perceived threat and Thorne into her sole, protective ally. She was forbidden from telling her family about the true extent of the financial support, forced to maintain the facade of the struggling student while living a secret life of opulence. This profound cognitive dissonance, the necessary lie to her family and friends, was the final, unbreakable psychological seal on the relationship. The lie became her prison, and Thorne held the keys, making him the only person who knew the real her, the one who wasn't struggling. The investigation, spearheaded by Detective Chen, focused on reconstructing this invisible psychological timeline. They managed to recover fragments of encrypted messages from an obscure private server, revealing Thorne's methodical approach. The recovered text was chillingly clinical, demonstrating that his communication was not driven by passion, but by a chilling documented methodology, a digital version of the Vance protocols. One message, sent 2 months before Zara's death, stood out. The dependency level is now stable. Shift from academic affirmation to possessive emotional claim. Repeat affirmation of her unique status. Eliminate remaining outside contacts. This message confirmed Chen's worst suspicion. Thorne was not a rogue predator. He was a master manipulator following a documented, systematic program of exploitation, treating Zara's life as a variable in a calculated equation. The psychological dissection of the victim was complete, revealing a vibrant, ambitious young woman who, faced with immense financial and cultural pressure, was groomed with surgical precision. The narrative was now set to move forward, following the methodical exposition of the grooming process to the chilling truth of her final isolated months. The construction of the gilded cage was now fully underway, detailing the calculated isolation that led to the tragic collapse. The systematic dismantling of Zahra Hassan's support network was the third and most critical phase of Marcus Thorne's grooming process. The move to the Santa Monica penthouse was the physical manifestation of her isolation, removing her from the casual, protective environment of the UCLA campus and placing her in a world where every need was met by Thorne and every external connection was severed. He weaponized her ambition against her, framing her new lifestyle not as a dependency, but as a necessary prerequisite for her elite future. She was told that her new peer group was the wealthy, the powerful, and the influential, and that her old student friends were merely distractions and average thinkers who would drag her down. This intellectual snobbery, subtly inserted into their conversations, was deeply effective on a young woman who craved academic success. Thorne's method of isolation was subtle and effective. He didn't forbid contact with her family, he simply made it impossible. He initiated an expensive, elaborate home renovation project for her parents in Damascus, a gift too generous to refuse, but one that consumed their entire focus, diverting their attention and making any detailed, probing conversation with Zahra an act of perceived ingratitude on her part. She felt the pressure to always project the perfect, happy image on their video calls, maintaining the lie to protect the beautiful but deceptive illusion he had built for them. Detective Chen's team, tracing the digital ghost of the wiped phone, managed to recover a single critical piece of encrypted text exchange with a former close friend, Layla, a fellow student from Beirut. The exchange, recovered from Layla's phone, detailed the rapid erosion of their friendship. Layla had expressed concern about Zahra's sudden wealth and her absenteeism from class. Zahra's final reply, sent 3 weeks before her death, was a chilling example of Thorne's psychological control. "You don't understand, Layla. He's not just helping me. He's teaching me how the world really works. I'm operating on a different level now. I can't explain. Just trust me." That phrase, "I can't explain," was the final wall, a manufactured secret that pushed her friend away and locked Zahra firmly within Thorne's narrative. The investigation's forensic accountant, brought in to dissect the finances of Pacific Vision Holdings, discovered the true nature of Thorne's financial control. It was a debt mechanism disguised as generosity. Every dollar spent on Zahra, from her tuition to her clothing, was meticulously tracked and categorized as an advance against her future earnings or a loan from the trust. She was a financially solvent 19-year-old on paper, but in reality, she was accruing a massive, unpayable debt to Thorne's network, a financial anchor that ensured her compliance and absolute dependence. This was the dark core of the exploitation. She was not a mistress or a companion. She was a meticulously leveraged asset. The revelation shattered the initial narrative of a simple, tragic sugar daddy relationship, exposing it as a complex financial and sexual exploitation scheme. The penthouse, the symbol of her success, was also the ledger of her debt. The detectives found an unmarked, sealed envelope hidden beneath a marble tile in the bathroom, a final desperate act by Zahra. Inside, there were no letters, no suicide notes, but 2 items: a tiny handwritten note with the cryptic phrase, "The contract is the chain," and a printout of an obscure legal document from the Cayman Islands detailing the terms of her trust. The document, once deciphered by Chen's legal experts, revealed a devastating clause. In the event of her withdrawal from the arrangement or her death, the entire outstanding loan would be immediately transferred as a legal debt to her next of kin, her family in Damascus. The note and the document were a final, chilling message. Zahra had realized her escape or death would financially destroy her family, making her absolute compliance a final, desperate act of self-sacrifice. She was trapped not by her own debt, but by the debt she would inflict on those she loved most. Thorne had engineered a trap with a catastrophic, emotional consequence, ensuring that even in death her silence was enforced. The discovery of the legal debt clause transformed the case from suspected murder to the definitive reality of premeditated exploitation and a final act of psychological torture. The investigators had the method, the motive, and the terrifying, meticulous proof of Thorne's professional criminality. The focus now shifted entirely to tracking the shadow architect, the elusive Marcus Thorne, a man who had left a massive psychological footprint, but no physical trace. The systematic exploitation was no longer a theory. It was documented, codified, and legally enforced, a stunning demonstration of how legal systems could be perverted to facilitate the most heinous of crimes. The entire narrative, which had moved from initial shock to the chilling reveal of psychological chains, now required the dramatic escalation of the investigation, the final, methodical tightening of the net around the seemingly untouchable predator. The search for Marcus Thorne became a study in the architecture of anonymity, the deliberate construction of a life designed to be invisible to both tax authorities and law enforcement. Thorne, the self-proclaimed philanthropist, was a ghost in the machine, utilizing a labyrinthine network of digital and analog defenses that dwarfed the complexity of the initial fraud. Detective Chen's asset tracing team quickly confirmed that Thorne's personal finances were indistinguishable from the shell corporations. He operated entirely on prepaid offshore corporate credit cards and non-KYC digital currencies, creating a seamless financial camouflage. His travel was equally opaque, always on private charter flights booked through third-party brokers, never registering under his own name, and utilizing a rotating series of diplomatic passports acquired through high-level contacts in unstable but wealthy island nations. The only pattern the investigators could discern was the lack of one. Thorne's movement was deliberately random, designed to defeat predictive algorithms and human intelligence alike. The breakthrough came not from tracking Thorne himself, but from profiling his primary support apparatus, the handful of loyal, non-sexual associates who managed the logistics of his predatory operation. Chen's team focused on Dr. Evelyn Reed, Thorne's longtime chief of staff, a woman who had meticulously managed the legal and financial structures of Pacific Vision Holdings. Reed, a brilliant but morally compromised lawyer, was not driven by greed, but by a deep-seated professional loyalty to Thorne, seeing him not as a criminal but as a misunderstood genius fighting a corrupt system. They arrested Reed quietly in a non-extradition European territory, leveraging international financial sanctions against the shell corporations she managed. Her initial silence was broken not by fear of prison, but by the undeniable proof of Thorne's ultimate cruelty, the discovery of Zara's final message, and the debt clause. Reed, who had always viewed the operation as high-risk financial restructuring, was genuinely sickened by the realization that she had been complicit in a scheme that financially chained a victim's family to her death. Her testimony was the crack in the foundation. Reed provided a complete, terrifying map of Thorne's digital footprint, including the coordinates of his emergency analog insurance policy, a highly secured physical server facility hidden beneath a defunct shipping warehouse in the industrial outskirts of Rotterdam. The facility, designed to withstand digital attack and physical search, contained the comprehensive, unwiped digital ledger of Thorne's entire operation, a physical manifestation of his supreme arrogance. He had kept every single communication, every contract, and every psychological profile of his victims, a private, boastful archive of his conquests. The recovery of the Rotterdam archive, a treasure trove of digital evidence, confirmed the full horrific scope of Thorne's operation. The files revealed that Zara was merely the latest casualty in a 5-year pattern of exploitation, involving at least a dozen young women, all vulnerable international students, all from high-pressure academic or financial backgrounds. The files contained a chilling risk matrix, a spreadsheet Thorne used to score potential victims based on their vulnerability quotient, VQ, and financial leverage factor, FLF. Zara's score was notably high, a VQ rooted in cultural isolation and ambition, and an FLF based on the ease of legally transferring her debt. The archive also provided the final, undeniable proof of the murder. A secret encrypted camera installed by Thorne in the Santa Monica penthouse's living room had recorded the moments leading up to Zara's death. The video, recovered by Chen's team, showed an argument fueled by Zara's desperate plea to end the relationship and her threat to expose the debt clause. Thorne's response was not explosive, but cold, deliberate, and terrifying. The video showed him calmly explaining the catastrophic financial consequences for her family before the final, brief, violent act that led to her collapse. The video concluded with Thorne meticulously wiping her phone and placing it neatly back on the bedside table, a terrifying act of final professional control. The evidence was irrefutable. The manhunt for Marcus Thorne, armed with the coordinates of his digital life and the absolute proof of his crime, now shifted into its final, most urgent phase. The physical capture of a man who believed his intellect and wealth had placed him beyond the reach of human justice. The meticulous planning of the initial fraud was now met with an equally meticulous, relentless application of investigative force, a final dramatic collision between arrogance and accountability. The systemic failures that allowed Thorne to operate, the blind spots in international finance, and the predatory nature of high-end unregulated mentorships were now exposed, a critical lesson learned through the tragic documented reality of Zahra Hassan's exploitation. The trail of Marcus Thorne, now fully illuminated by the Rotterdam archives, led the investigative team to a highly secured private estate in the French countryside. Thorne, still unaware of Dr. Reed's defection and the seizure of his physical server, was hiding in plain sight, living under the diplomatic protection of one of his purchased passports, a final, arrogant demonstration of his belief in the system's susceptibility to money. The decision was made to execute a quiet, swift capture, avoiding the international media spectacle that Thorne undoubtedly would have leveraged to fuel his narrative of victimhood and political persecution. The French authorities, alerted to the nature of the crime, not just financial, but involving the exploitation and murder of an international student, moved decisively. The capture itself was anticlimactic, a rapid surgical breach by a specialized tactical unit. Thorne was found in his study, sitting at a custom-made desk, engrossed in reading a high-level economic journal, a glass of fine whiskey at his side. When the commandos entered, his only reaction was a slight sigh, a look of mild irritation at the interruption. There was no resistance, no plea, just a cold, intellectual resignation, mirroring the studied indifference he had shown in the video of Zahra's final moments. His first words, delivered in impeccable, detached English, were a final, chilling summation of his entire predatory philosophy. "You should know, gentlemen, that she chose this. I simply optimized the transaction." The ensuing interrogation, conducted by Detective Chen and an FBI behavioral analyst, was less about gathering facts and more about dissecting the motive. Thorne, now stripped of his digital and financial armor, was devastatingly honest, his arrogance unshakable. He freely admitted to the systematic use of the risk matrix, the debt clause, and the psychological grooming. He didn't see himself as a predator, but as a market maker in human ambition, filling a supply and demand gap in the global economy of dreams. He argued with cold, terrifying logic that he provided capital, safety, and an accelerated social status, and in return, he demanded control. The murder he dismissed as a logistical failure, a necessary correction when the asset became volatile and threatened to expose the system. He maintained that Zahra's resistance was a sign of her immaturity, a failure to accept the terms of the real world he had offered her. The most revealing part of his interrogation was his reaction to the video evidence. When confronted with the footage of the murder, Thorne watched himself on the screen with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an experiment. He criticized his own performance, noting that he should have been more precise, less emotionally reactive, but never expressed remorse for the victim. The behavioral analyst's profile was clear. Thorne suffered from a highly functional form of psychopathy, seeing people not as human beings but as variables to be controlled and exploited for his own intellectual and emotional gratification. The money was merely the mechanism. The ultimate motive was the unassailable control over another person's trajectory, proving his superiority over the chaotic, unpredictable human condition. The trial, held in a neutral jurisdiction, became a global focal point, a necessary spectacle to confront the dark side of wealth and influence. The prosecution, leveraging the meticulous documentation recovered from the Rotterdam archive, presented a narrative that was unassailable. The crime was not a sudden act of passion, but the final inevitable conclusion of a premeditated systematic scheme of exploitation, a documented process of psychological terror culminating in murder. The narrative of the sympathetic, vulnerable student, Zahra Hassan, was juxtaposed against the cold, clinical arrogance of the wealthy manipulator, Marcus Thorne, ensuring that the jury understood the massive, intentional power imbalance. The sheer volume of evidence, the risk matrix, the debt contracts, the chilling video, turned the trial into a brutal forensic dissection of Thorne's moral void. His conviction was swift and absolute, a necessary but ultimately insufficient closure for the family in Damascus, who now faced the impossible task of grieving for a daughter they thought they knew, while also grappling with the terrifying, secret life she had been forced to live. The investigation had moved from a tragic initial report to the successful conviction of a master manipulator, but the narrative required one final somber act, the lasting legacy of the exploited dream. The ultimate legacy of the Zahra Hassan case is a sobering, necessary recalibration of the global understanding of modern exploitation, moving the focus from the dark alley to the high-rise penthouse, from brute force to psychological finesse. Her tragic story permanently exposed the systemic vulnerabilities that exist in the nexus of international education, wealth, and unchecked influence. The California legislature, galvanized by the evidence of the debt clause, passed the Zahra Hassan Act, a landmark piece of legislation that voided any private financial agreement that transferred a victim's debt to their next of kin in cases of documented exploitation or sexual coercion. The act became a template for other jurisdictions, a necessary legal shield against the kind of sophisticated, contractual enslavement that Thorne had engineered. The university community also underwent a profound, necessary change. UCLA and institutions like it implemented mandatory comprehensive reporting structures for students receiving significant external, non-institutional financial aid, specifically designed to detect the telltale signs of isolation and dependency. The sudden withdrawal from social activities, the unexplained shift in wealth, and the use of offshore financial structures. The lesson learned was that silence and secrecy are the primary tools of the predator, and institutional vigilance is the only countermeasure. The Zahra Hassan case became a global reference point in the fight against high-end human trafficking, not just because of the successful conviction, but because of the meticulous documentation that illuminated the criminal methodology. Detective Chen, now a recognized expert in financial and psychological exploitation, often speaks about the case, always reiterating the same chilling truth. The crime was a financial one, a murder paid for with a debt. The cost of Zahra's education, her clothes, and her luxurious final months was systematically tallied and then used as the final absolute leverage point that sealed her fate. Marcus Thorne, now serving a life sentence, remains unrepentant, viewing his imprisonment as a final political persecution by a system that failed to grasp his vision. He spends his days attempting to write a memoir, which he insists on calling The Optimization of Consent, a final grotesque continuation of his self-serving narrative. His ultimate fate, however, is irrelevant compared to the systemic changes his crime necessitated. The enduring image of the case is not the lavish penthouse or the arrested predator, but the handwritten note found by Zahra. The contract is the chain. It is a final, poignant piece of dramatic irony, the victim's ultimate realization that the symbol of her financial liberation was, in fact, the instrument of her absolute servitude. Zahra Hassan did not choose her end. She was systematically maneuvered into a corner where death or compliance were the only options, and her final act was a desperate, failed attempt to protect her family from the financial consequences of her final choice. Her story is a perpetual, somber reminder that the greatest vulnerability lies not in external markets or foreign threats, but in the internal human desire for success, status, and the desperate hope for a better life. A desire that, when coupled with isolation and fear, creates the perfect exploitable dream. The vigilance must be absolute, because the modern predator no longer looks for the desperate. They look for the ambitious, leveraging the promise of everything into the reality of nothing. The entire structure of the exploitation, from the calculated flattery to the final, violent collapse, proves that the highest form of criminality is the methodical, psychological destruction of the human spirit. The case remains a cold, silent benchmark against which all future acts of high-stakes exploitation must be measured.